It seems that the topic I would be talking about is depressing, all right? But end times, and which I just explain at great length in this book, is also the times of new beginnings. So I'm an optimist by nature, and that's what I would like to convey to you here today, is that perhaps we have some difficult times ahead of us, but we can survive them if we collectively pull together, and we can get into better times after surviving this period. But let me just explain to you what are end times. My research and colleagues with whom I work have been studying human civilizations, focusing on the last 5,000 years since the large-scale complex societies organized as states have first appeared on the scene. And over these 5,000 years, the state-organized societies have taken over the world. So now nearly everybody lives in states. So what can we tell about historical dynamics of states? Well, first of all, by studying hundreds of past societies, we determined that they can go for a period of time working reasonably functionally, keeping internal order, peace and order. These times may last roughly a century, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. But at least so far, at least in the past, inevitably the good times, these integrative periods, as you call them, ended, and societies entered the periods of social unrest, political fragmentation, and sometimes quite extreme violence, with certain cases collapse of civilizations, although that's not inevitable. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So why do we see these complex societies enter into end times? There are several reasons, but what's interesting is that even though societies, let's say in China, were very different from societies in Mexico and those from Europe, and medieval societies are quite different from more modern societies, but at some abstract general level, the road to crisis is quite similar. And there are several forces pushing societies into political instability, but one of the most important forces is what we call elite overproduction. Essentially, it's a situation when there are too many elite wannabes, too many people vying for a fixed number of power positions. And when this competition begins to become very intense, societies get into these end times. And what are those end times? Just to give you quick examples. Well, think about the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the English Civil War of the 17th century, or the 30 Years' War in this part of the world between 1618 and 1648. Those were all outbreaks of political violence driven by internal reasons, and the most important internal reason was this elite overproduction. All right, so the next question is, let me expand on this. First of all, who are the elites? All right, here we use a neutral sociological definition. Essentially, these are not the better people or worse people or whatever. It's the small proportion of the population that concentrates social power in their hands. Social power is the ability to influence other people's behavior, and it comes in four basic flavors. First of all, you can force people to do it, so this is the military or coercive power. You can pay people to do what you want, this is economic power. You can order them by virtue of being the boss, that's the administrative or political power. And the softest, but extremely powerful power is ideological. You can persuade dissuasion. You can persuade people to do what you would like them to do. So the power distributed unequally in human societies. We all know that. And there is 1, 2, 3% who concentrate social power in their hands. The next question we want to know, and these are the elites. The next question, the critical question that we want to know is, what are the dynamics of elites? How are elites reproduced and recruited? Right? So that's where the crux of the story is that at different times during the life cycles of civilizations and societies and states, sometimes you see a reasonable match. There's always more elite aspirants, people who want to get into power positions, and some competition is good because it allows the better ones to take the positions. But if the competition begins to be too high, too much of it, too much competition is actually corrosive. So in the book, I use a game to illustrate this idea. Many of you are familiar with the game of musical chairs. So think about it. It's a slightly different game. We still have 10 chairs. You start with 11 players, right? The music plays, everybody walks around, then the music stops, people sit down, and one person is the loser, right? But instead of removing chairs and playing this game again, what we are going to do, we're going to keep the same chairs, but we add players. Right? So you start with 11 players and 12 players and 15, 20, 30, 40. You can imagine what's going to happen, right? Don't play this game at your next children's party, okay? Because as soon as your competition begins to be so intense, some players, because humans are not mathematical agents imagined by game theorists, right? Who always follow rules. So somebody will start breaking rules. You know, for example, I will slow down, stand right next to the chair. The music stops, I sit down. Other people will figure it out. So very soon you'll have several groups at each chair and then pushing and then perhaps even fist fights. And this is actually a good analogy. What happens to human societies? When you get too many elite wannabes, right? The number of losers starts to increase exponentially. And some of those will decide to break rules, and then when they break rules, the rule breaking spreads, that destroys the institutions and social norms that govern, let's say, our democratic societies, but also in non-democratic, in past societies, it was the same thing. There were too many pretenders to the throne and too many of their supporters, and that as this competition increases beyond bound, then it inevitably led to violence. All right, so just to give you some of the frustrated elites who don't get their positions, they start breaking rules, turn to violence. We call them counter-elites. Who are those counter-elites? Well, think about Lenin and the Bolsheviks, Castro and the Barbudos. Think about dissidents in present-day America who are taking over the Republican Party. All right, so the next question is why do societies sometimes start developing this elite overproduction problem? All right, so here we have to look, because elites are only a small part of the society, and so we think of societies at a very basic level organized as the general populations who are workers typically, and their families and children, so on and so forth, ruling elites, and then of course the state apparatus. Typically at the beginning of these cycles, and remember these are not mathematically precise cycles, they vary in period, and also they are not inevitable. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, because it is possible to actually avoid the worst, the civil wars, revolutions, and outright collapse. All right, but in the beginning of this, at the beginning of this good periods, right, the integrative phases as we call them, the societies are typically in balance. So the fruits of the economy, or in our societies we have economic growth, so the fruits of economic growth are divided fairly between the workers and the bosses. So for example, in the United States, from the New Deal until 1970s, if you were to plot the median, the typical wage, and the GDP per capita, they would grow together until late 1970s. You may have seen this famous graph of American worker productivity, which keeps going up, and the compensation, which goes up together with productivity until 1970s, and then just stops growing and even declines. All right, so what happens? This is a very generic thing. It happens not only in our modern societies. In the past, in agrarian societies, for example, the peasants were generating the wealth, and at some point, the nobility started to cut into the share of the common population we're getting from the economy. Why does it happen? Technical term is the iron law of oligarchy. But essentially, it's because the people in power, they can do it. Right? They have power, and they use this power to reconfigure the society in their own favor. All right, so that's essentially why this breaking point occurs. And when they do that, they create this perverse wealth pump, which takes wealth from the poor and gives it to the rich. And that's why you see typically the inequality increase during the periods before crisis, as we see in the United States, for example, over the past 50 years or so. That has three bad consequences. First of all, it creates what we call popular immiseration. Right? Very simply, the declining standards of living, that creates a lot of discontent, and that means that population can be mobilized against the social order, which majority of them perceives as unjust, because they see that they're doing worse than their parents. That's the obvious thing. But less obvious thing, and let's now talk about societies that I studied, such as the United States. The less obvious thing is that this wealth pump starts creating more and more wealthy people. And this was, in fact, in the United States, once the wealth pump got going in the late 1970s, it started churning out wealthy people like centimillionaires, decamillionaires, people who have 10 million or more of wealth, 100 million or more wealth, and billionaires. The numbers of billionaires exploded. Right? In fact, the numbers of, let's say, 10 people, decamillionaires, they increased by a factor of 10. All right? So we have 7 times as many decamillionaires per capita, because population has also grown. So we have 7 times as many decamillionaires per capita today compared to 45 years ago. Now, you might say, well, this is just the American dream, so what's bad about it? We have these wealthy people, so they're successful, and so on and so forth. Well, the problem is that when we start overproducing wealthy people, many of them want to transform their wealth into political power. So Donald Trump is, of course, one example of that, but there are many other people. So this is one of the major routes why you create elite overproduction, which has worked over the last 5,000 years. You have many more aspirants for those political positions because of the wealth pump. The third thing is even more subtle. Because the wealth pump is taking away from the majority of the population and giving it to the rich, that means that you create a lot of pressure for people in that immiserated masses to escape it.
And how do you do it? Well, today, everybody tells you go to college or university. Then tell you get master's, PhD, law degree, whatever. So this is what we've seen in the United States at this point. We are overproducing, let's say, law degrees by a factor of 3 to 1. There are 3 times as many graduates from law schools compared to the positions that they have. And by the way, AI is going to take half of those positions away. So very soon you'll have 6 to 1 ratio, but that's another story. All right, so, and lawyers, why am I privileging lawyers? Because it turns out that this is one of the most dangerous counter-elites. So Lenin was a lawyer, Castro was a lawyer, Robespierre was a lawyer, Gandhi was a lawyer, although he was using less violent means, and Lincoln was a lawyer. So lawyers are, first of all, especially that's in the United States, since I know that situation very from inside out, they are very ambitious, they are well networked, well organized, and they are heavily indebted, because that's how you get through law school. This is the recipe for creating counter-elites. All right, so just to finish things up, so far I've been talking about how societies get into the crisis periods, and this is fairly well channelized. It's, again, even such different societies as Imperial China or medieval France or today's United States, if you step away and look at them at the structure in terms of elites, population, and the state apparatus, it is very similar. So the road to crisis, it's like a valley with pretty high walls, and the ball is rolling down. There is really no place for it to go but to get to the crisis. But once you get to the crisis, it's a cusp, and a whole bunch of different avenues opens up. And this is why there is a lot of variability. Sometimes you see outright collapse, where more than half of the population is gone, or sometimes 90% of population is gone. Complete political fragmentation. The elites are slaughtered in civil wars and proscriptions and things like that. But there are other cases where you see the elites pull together and cooperate with the population and get the right set of reforms and policies and resolve situation without bloodshed. This has happened actually in the United States as a result of progressive era and New Deal. This happened in Great Britain during the Chartist period, and we have several such. It's not a very common outcome, but this is one of the reasons why there is a lot of hope, because this means that once you get to the crisis, you can actually, well, not you or I individually, but we can collectively do the right thing and push the trajectory to better outcomes. And the final thought is, this is very new. We have collected data of about 200 past societies, ranging over the world and over the millennia. And so what we see is that also there is a tendency for the crisis to become less steep, less destructive, and also the periods for the next reconstitution of the society and the start of a new good integrative period happens faster. So this is clearly the result of accumulation of institutions. As a result of evolution, the humanity seems to learn collectively from these terrible examples, and we have now layers of institutions. So the obvious ones, for example, the democratic institutions, they really do work. I mean, it's not panacea. It doesn't mean that if you live in a democratic society, you're immune for this, but it means that you have a better chance of avoiding the worst. So here is that I just want to end on this more optimistic note by saying that first of all, there is no inevitability, and we are studying actually how do past societies who avoided bloody revolutions and civil wars course, how did they do it, right? And this is very much work in progress. And also, the institutions that we have accumulated over the past thousands of years, they are actually working, if imperfectly. And that, to me, gives some optimism in our ability to overcome these problems. And if you don't do it this time around, I feel sure that the next time, and this crisis tend to recur every couple hundred years, right? The next time around, I think that we will actually be able to flatten the curve and avoid the crisis. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Let me just grab my cup of water.
Of course. Now it is time for you guys to ask some questions. I know that a lot of questions may have arisen during this time. So make yourselves known, raise your hands. Our volunteers will come find you. But if you get the mic, please stand so that we can see you clearly. We have a gentleman back there with a white t-shirt. Yeah, have a seat over here.
You obviously mentioned about growing inequality in the world in the United States after 1970s. My question is, do you consider in that case neoliberalism as a direct cause of deliberate actions of elites, or maybe it's vice versa?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question, thank you. So remember, it's not just inequality. Inequality is really a proxy for the problems that are building up. The real problems are popular discontent, which can be mobilized by counter elites that are ambitious to advance their agenda, right? So it's really elite overproduction and mass mobilization. But getting the neoliberal ideology, exactly. In fact, in the United States, we see that neoliberal ideology have spread precisely just during the 1970s. Well, they've been spreading, there's been some groups working on this, you know, Mount Pelerin Society, right, and so on and so forth, but they started grabbing people in power during the 1970s. That's when we see greed is good, well, in the 1980s, really. It's a very gradual process. And yes, it is definitely a device ideological device that some factions of the elites have used to advance their agenda and essentially to turn on the wealth pump by abandoning the developments during the New Deal, such as during the Reagan administration, there was diminution of worker power, labor unions. I can give you reducing the taxes on the top incomes and so on and so forth. So essentially, it was the ideological basis for turning the wealth pump on was provided by neoliberal economic theories.
We got a gentleman in the front row here.
How global is this crisis of the elites? Because if we check Russia, China, the EU, or the United States, everywhere, at least I can see that the elites are more disconnected from the reality than ever in everywhere. So is there any place where the situation is better or not?
Yeah, so this is also a very good question. So in the past, we see that these end times, they tend to cluster. So for example, the age of revolutions, which is the first half of the 19th century, but a little broader than that, there was 1848, there were revolutions pretty much everywhere, all right? And there were also very close by civil war in the United States. The worst civil war, the bloodiest civil war in human history was the Taiping Rebellion in China, also 1860s. So there is some clustering because no country lives in isolation, and these influences sometimes get the synchronization going on. But this synchronization is not perfect. So for example, if we use again inequality, growth of inequality as the proxy, what we see is the United States was the first. This is where the inequality started growing around 1980. In Germany, it was about 20 years later, all right? Whereas China is in the counter phase. China had a really horrible century of emulation. They emerged from it much later than the age of revolutions here in Europe. And so China is currently in its integrative period, all right? So I'm not suggesting that you should immigrate to China. I hope that you all will take this as trying to figure out how we can collectively solve this problem. But there is enough variation that, between different regions of the world.
Excuse me, if we differentiate between globalists and elites, do you think that there is also a fight between globalists, or that those conflicts that we see is like Pepsi or Coca-Cola and there is a unified vision for globalists? For example, every nation I see are pushed hard to enter to the digital age and the central bank digital currency, and there seems to be no conflict here, although there are quite dangerous consequences for such. So do you differentiate between globalists and elites, and do you think there is a unified vision behind all of those conflicts? Thank you.
Let's see. Let me try to address this question from the, again, American-centric point of view, because that's a situation I know best. Essentially, in the United States, the ruling elites now, they have a globalist agenda because it is incredibly lucrative for them. In Europe, we see this happen later. Also, the spread of neoliberal ideology, you can basically trace it, that it has really started in the United States and then spread to Europe. So in Denmark, for example, which used to be a very social democratic country, we now see the elites are being swayed by this seductive ideology because it's so self-serving, right? And globalism is part of that neoliberalism because, for example, the market should decide, oh no, the government should not be part of the equation, and also you should open the markets globally. So this is part of the globalist agenda. But in the United States, there is a big backlash against it. So some of the dissidents now trying to take over the Republican Party, they were definitely very much anti-globalists. They are much more America firsters and things like that. And we see similar counter influences in the United States. Typically, it's interesting that it's typically associated with right-wing populism rather than left-wing populism. And so we see that AfD in Germany, and parties of this kind. Am I addressing your question?
Roughly, yes. But so, for example, even if it looks that the populists in America are doing something against globalists, but it looks like they are also following some global rules. For example, pushing into the digital age. This is one of them. And you can feel that there are some people who can create such a conflict, like, oh, I'm anti-globalist, but you are doing exactly what they want without knowing.
Well, my thinking is this. I don't have a very good answer to this, but I'm not against progress, right? And digital technologies, like any technology, can be used for good or bad. And so it's essentially our job to make sure that we use this technology to advance broad-based well-being rather than narrow interests of very, top groups.
Thank you very much. Please give it up for Peter Turchin, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.